Earlier today, Cyberpunk 2077 got a 20GB new update, this known as patch 1.62. At least it's known as that for some of you. This is a pretty interesting and more complex update, as it's actually pretty big for Cyberpunk overall, but it's only actually going to be a usable update for a small subset of players. For starters, this update is only going to be on PC, being a roughly 20GB download on Steam, but much smaller at 1.5GB on GOG. But then it does need to patch around 50GB of your files. This update will technically add in a few new things. The new ray tracing overdrive mode. This new mode will bring visuals in Cyberpunk 2077 to a completely new level. And although the mode is technically only recommended for those with 4000 series NVIDIA GPUs or a 3090, it actually says this in the game, you are able to turn on this mode even if you don't meet those requirements. So if you have a 3080, 3070, or even a 2060, you could attempt to play with this. Now, of course, you're not going to have the best FPS unless you do have something like a 3080 and maybe even a 3070, but if you do want to mess around, it's available for you, and there's actually a pretty handy optional setting to enable path tracing just for photo mode. So even if you can't run the entire game with this new feature turned on, you're able to take stunning pictures with it turned on. And although path tracing or ray tracing overdrive is going to be the big part of this new update, it actually isn't all. DLAA was added. This is going to be a new form of anti-aliasing that can be used by NVIDIA users, and there's even a new upscaler with Intel XeSS that you can use as an alternative to FSR or DLSS. Unfortunately, outside of that, there were no other features added to the game, at least as far as I can tell. Doesn't seem like there were any hidden changes around the world, bug fixes, or balance changes, and the real major new addition here is the new ray tracing overdrive mode. This being created as a collaboration between NVIDIA and CD Projekt Red, and actually more on that later in this video, as there definitely has been some pushback around this collaboration. But really at its core, this update's going to bring Cyberpunk 2077 truly to the next gen, making it one of the single best looking games on the market right now, but at a cost. So to explain this new feature, we really need to get some definitions out of the way. By default, Cyberpunk 2077 of course has its standard lighting system. This lighting system relies on something known as rasterization, and functionally it's just how lighting works in most video games you've played. It's not bad, it's not great, it's just kind of the standard lighting you're probably used to. Of course, over the past couple of years, we've seen ray tracing break out onto the market, and Cyberpunk has this also. Ray tracing will actually track some light sources, so this should hopefully lead to more accurate lighting compared to the typical rasterization method, as these individual rays are being tracked and you can see some of the impacts of that. But in reality, ray tracing is only going to be partial ray tracing, because as soon as one of those rays of light actually bounces off of something, it'll switch back to the typical rasterization method. So in reality, ray tracing is really going to be a mix of rasterization and ray tracing. And the new thing we have is path tracing. This is the big new feature with this update, and in effect, this is going to be all ray traced lighting. So even when a light bounces, it'll continue to be ray traced as opposed to rasterized. And it basically is just simulating light almost exactly how it works in the real world, where lights bouncing around will be accounted for and actually illuminate things. And that's great, it all sounds great, but what does it actually mean in game? Comparing the standard lighting in Cyberpunk 2077 to both ray tracing and now path tracing with this new ray tracing overdrive mode, you can actually see a lightness curve of sorts. With the standard lighting using rasterization, lots of things are just artificially lit. Despite there not being a logical light source, you'll notice things are generally just going to be quite a bit brighter. Like the side of this seat with the standard lighting is just glowing yellow as if a light is being shown on it, even though there isn't actually a light directly shining on it. But as soon as you turn on regular ray tracing and a light bounce is accounted for, things become far darker. The location of shadows is more accurate now. If you look back at that seat, it is now being lit by a totally different light source and glowing blue. But as you then progress to the big daddy of path tracing, multiple light bounces are accounted for. You'll notice things brighten back up again as a light is bouncing around in each scene even more now. And one of the big benefits you should hopefully notice almost immediately with path tracing is there's going to be a much larger contrast between areas that are lit versus not lit. Areas that are lit are going to be bright and have their lighting actually color that area, where areas that don't have direct light on them are actually going to be much darker now and shadows accurately represented. There's a far larger contrast between lit and non-lit areas, especially when you can compare this to just typical rasterization, where everything just kind of has this broad lightness to it. And you can clearly see this in V's apartment. On regular lighting, you'll see things are really well lit, even from a distance. Once you turn on ray tracing, things become a bit more accurate, but also far darker. But then with path tracing, things are brightened up once again because light is able to now bounce around and actually illuminate things based off bounces. And as you cycle through these, you can almost see that lightness to being much darker to actually lighting up again as path tracing is accounted for. But one of the biggest changes you'll notice with this, outside of just some of that shadowing, is light color and temperature properly being implemented here. If you look back at that restaurant scene once again, we see a mix of warm colors and cool bluing colors, and things are just really all over the place. With ray tracing on, things go far cooler overall, but once you actually get into path tracing, you get a more accurate general warmth from those overhead lights and what sun is getting in. And with some of these comparisons of ray tracing versus path tracing, you'll notice the entire color of the scene will change as the light source is now able to bounce around more, and in turn, whatever that original light was, if it's blue, orange, or some other color, you'll actually see that light almost infect the scene more and change the overall color dynamic. At some points, it almost literally looks like you're turning off or on a reshader E and B with how different the light coloring is. And you can see it really clearly on this car still. With path tracing on, the building and side rails are glowing pink due to the sign actually reflecting off of them. But with just the regular ray tracing, since the light bounces aren't being accounted for, most of that is unaffected. And the other major part you're going to notice here is accurate shadowing. Look at this car scene with ray tracing. The car has almost no shadowing on its side, where once you switch to path tracing, you can immediately see the car's casting a shadow, the bumper is no longer artificially illuminated. And one of the really cool parts about this is it's really going to apply to the game overall. You can see here that even in the distance, those arches are casting much more profound shadows with path tracing compared to ray tracing, and it just gives the lighting in the world a more layered and substantial look. And things that are meant to be bright are actually bright now. You can see with path tracing, this illuminated sign is almost too bright. And when compared to ray tracing, you can really see this actually has a much larger impact on the environment overall, with that sign really illuminating things around it. And one of the things that you may notice the biggest difference with in-game are actually car headlights. You can probably see it most accurately as I'm parked up against this wall. With path tracing, my light will actually flood the scene, and we can see more light being reflected in the environment. And you can even see some of the accurate shadowing behind the tires of the car. And a cool thing this will extend to are also muzzle flashes, which will now cast accurate shadows. You can see with ray tracing, the muzzle flash almost just illuminates the ground in a circle, while with path tracing, there is a clearer edge where the shadow is being created and there's a fade as the light dissipates. So now, of course, as you do turn on path tracing, you start to experience the game with this. One of the big questions people are going to have is, what kind of hit on FPS are we talking about here? There are a ton of benchmarks online, but from my perspective, I was using a system with a 4090 running at 4K resolution. My other specs are on screen. Without DLSS, path tracing is basically unusable. Without DLSS on, I get under 20 FPS while using path tracing. But even just turning on DLSS 2.0, which many modern NVIDIA GPUs will be able to use, I was able to use path tracing at 4K with the game absolutely maxed out at about 60 FPS comfortably. And although there were definitely some drops from time to time, this is definitely playable with just DLSS 2.0. It seems like this definitely could be playable even with an older NVIDIA card, like a 3080. Yeah, it does feel wild calling a 3080 an older card, but if you drop the resolution under 4K and use something like DLSS, you should be able to experience path tracing at least somewhat. And if you have the big guns with DLSS 3.0 or frame generation, those two are the same thing, which does require you to have a 4000 series GPU, you'll actually get a pretty good amount of FPS here. On my 4090 with path tracing on and every other feature maxed out, I was able to get about 95 FPS on average, running at 4K. In some scenes, my FPS would drop, but rarely did I even drop under 70 FPS. I was always above 60, definitely, and even at points, I was above 100 FPS when nothing too crazy was going on. And despite how complicated path tracing is on the game, it seems like this is actually very usable. It seems like users, even with a 4070, should be able to experience path tracing. You likely won't be able to play at maxed out settings, and definitely not at 4K, but at 1440p with DLSS 3.0, you definitely can experience Cyberpunk with path tracing on, even on a 4070, which is pretty impressive. But then the other question is, should you turn it on? One of the interesting parts about path tracing overall is, as you're really focusing on the differences, they become abundantly clear. You get far greater color accuracy in your scenes, truly representative shadows, and just in general, the game will be more accurately lit, and in turn, even quite nicely brighter. But at the same time, I do honestly feel like for a lot of players, once you actually get into the game, you get into that fast-paced Cyberpunk 2077 action, I'm not sure how obvious the benefits of path tracing will actually be, especially when you don't have a comparison in front of you. So I was kind of left wondering, is that 30 FPS drop that I personally experienced worth the visual enhancements here? I think for a lot of people, especially those who spent the money on a 4090, they're going to say yes, but at the same time, once things start going, the benefits are definitely far less obvious. Like for example, the entire gameplay segment I've been showing you for this segment of the video was actually without path tracing. I was just using regular old ray tracing, and I feel like for a lot of you, you are probably watching this thinking it looks good, not realizing that it actually isn't even with the new feature. So now, switching back to ray tracing overdrive and with path tracing back on in this gameplay, things are definitely stunning. It is a really nice addition to the game. The benefits are definitely there, especially while playing at nighttime or even while in certain interiors, but I think there's quite a few people that might prefer the extra FPS as opposed to the visual bonuses. Being able to play Cyberpunk at 130 FPS on average with just regular ray tracing was actually pretty incredible, especially on a high refresh rate screen. For me, I'm definitely going to be keeping on path tracing. I think it does create a lot of those occasional stop and admire moments. You're just wandering around Night City and really have to stop to take it all in because things look great with this mode, and I think it just brings Cyberpunk to a new level of beauty in gaming overall. I would argue this marks Cyberpunk as one of the best looking video games on the market right now, and I think we're seeing the future of gaming. Path tracing is going to eventually become much more standard, almost like how ray tracing is in many games nowadays. With that said, there definitely is some user frustration around this update. On one hand, many mods, especially those core mods like Cyber Engine tweaks and Red 4 Extended, are broken, so you're gonna have to wait for those to be updated, although typically it's very quickly, so I wouldn't be shocked if even by the time this video is live, those mods are updated. But even further, there definitely is some frustration in the community with creating a feature for Cyberpunk 2077 that only a relatively small subset of the community could take advantage of. And although I do definitely understand that perspective, part of me doesn't agree with it. On one hand, this actually was some NVIDIA devs and CDPR devs, it wasn't just CDPR working on this thing. But even further, I do feel like this does give Cyberpunk quite a longer life. The game is going to look really good for even years into the future. The next Cyberpunk game is not coming anytime soon, and I feel like in the future there'll be many people who are able to actually upgrade and be able to use DLSS 3.0 and take advantage of this new feature. Although it is definitely one of those situations where I could see both sides. I see the argument for and the argument against, but it also doesn't really matter because this is what CDPR decided to use at least some of their dev time on. And with that said, that is the latest update to Cyberpunk 2077. A look at path tracing, what it adds in, and my thoughts on the improvements overall. If you are interested in improving your Cyberpunk even a bit further, recently modders have been adding in new quests to the game, marking a major milestone in what mods can do.